Welcome to Epic World History. Today, we journey into the rise of the Visigoths, once desperate refugees at the Danube, who became Rome's most dangerous enemy. From hunger and betrayal to rebellion, and the shattering Battle of Adrianople, this story reveals how the fall of one empire gave birth to a new destiny for Europe. In 376 AD, the Roman Empire faced a turning point unlike any before. From the northern banks of the Danube, the Visigoths, a proud and warlike people, sought shelter within Roman lands. They were not invaders in that moment, but refugees fleeing a storm greater than themselves, the relentless advance of the Huns. The world of the Visigoths had been shattered. Families abandoned villages, warriors carried only what they could, and entire tribes marched south toward the empire they had once fought. For Rome, this was no simple encounter. It was the beginning of a crisis that would test the strength of imperial borders, the limits of Roman diplomacy, and the fate of Gothic history. The Visigoths were one of the great Gothic nations, fierce, independent, and deeply rooted in the forests and plains beyond the Roman frontier. For centuries, they had clashed with Rome in bloody wars. Yet in 376 AD, desperation transformed enemies into supplicants. The barbarian migration was not a single horde, but countless families. Men with spears, women carrying infants, carts piled with grain, and memories of home. Roman commanders along the Danube witnessed an ocean of humanity pressing at their gates. To deny them meant starvation and slaughter by the Huns. To accept them risked unleashing chaos within the empire itself. It was a decision no Roman governor wished to make lightly. The Danube River became the line between despair and survival. The Visigoths gathered along its banks, their wagons stretching for miles. Children cried from hunger, elders collapsed from exhaustion, and warriors looked anxiously across the waters into Roman lands. They begged for safe passage. For Emperor Valens, ruling from Constantinople, the petition posed both danger and opportunity. By settling the Visigoths inside the Roman Empire, he might gain new soldiers for his armies. Yet to open the gates meant trusting a people once branded as barbarians. Valens authorized their crossing, believing Roman might and Roman law could contain the Gothic tide. But behind the promise of aid, corruption and mismanagement festered. What began as a migration of refugees soon grew into a tragedy of betrayal and rage. The crossing of the Danube was one of the largest barbarian migrations Rome had ever seen. Thousands upon thousands entered, whole clans moving south. The Romans provided boats, but the sheer numbers overwhelmed any order. Some tried to swim the river and drowned. Others were separated from kin, their belongings lost in the rush. At first, the Visigoths hoped for a new beginning. They imagined fields to farm, markets to trade, and peace beneath the shadow of Rome. But Roman officials exploited their weakness. Supplies promised to the refugees were withheld unless bribes were paid. Some Visigoths sold their children into slavery to purchase scraps of rotten meat. Hunger turned hope into bitterness, and bitterness into fury. The Visigoth migration revealed the deep cracks within the Roman Empire. Once, Rome had prided itself on order and discipline, but in 376 AD, greed reigned stronger than duty. Roman governors enriched themselves by extorting the newcomers. Soldiers forced the Visigoths to hand over weapons, leaving them vulnerable, while merchants gouged them with impossible prices. Far from being welcomed as allies, the Visigoths became prisoners in their new home. Resentment spread among their warriors, who remembered the proud days when they had stood as equals on the battlefield. Now, humiliated and starving, they whispered of rebellion. Rome had invited the Visigoths in as refugees, but was sowing the seeds of revolt that would shake the empire. The Visigoths were not a single tribe, but a confederation of many clans, led by chiefs who held fragile authority. At their head stood Fritigern, a leader of vision and cunning. He had once fought Rome, but now sought survival within its walls. Fritigern pleaded with Roman officials for fair treatment, reminding them of the emperor's promise. But his words fell on deaf ears. The Visigoths, trapped in provinces unable to sustain them, grew restless. They saw their people starve, while Roman grain was stored for profit. Fritigern's authority grew stronger, not because of Rome's favor, but because his people trusted him to lead them through injustice. The Gothic history of this moment was not one of conquest, but of survival against betrayal. In their suffering, the Visigoths remembered their long history of conflict with Rome. Just decades earlier, Gothic warriors had raided across the empire, their horsemen feared on the frontier. Yet now, those same warriors were reduced to begging for food. Pride burned within them, and whispers spread that Rome had no intention of honoring its word. Stories circulated of children sold for dog meat, of nobles humiliated before Roman officials. For the Visigoths, survival was no longer about mere shelter, it was about dignity. And when dignity is denied, rebellion becomes inevitable. What had begun as a humanitarian crisis was transforming into one of the greatest threats the Roman Empire had ever faced. As tensions deepened, the Roman commanders underestimated the desperation of the Visigoths. To them, these people were still barbarians useful as soldiers, but unworthy of trust. They failed to see that hunger can be more powerful than any sword. When Visigoth delegations went to Roman camps to plead for food, they were mocked or turned away. In some cases, Roman officials sold dog meat to the starving refugees at exorbitant prices. Humiliation burned in the hearts of Gothic warriors. Families who had once dreamed of becoming Roman subjects now swore vengeance. What Rome perceived as manageable unrest was in truth a storm gathering strength. The Visigoth migration, meant to secure peace, was becoming the prelude to war. Fritigern, the Visigoth leader, realized that patience had reached its end. He gathered his warriors in secret councils, urging unity. "We came as refugees," he declared, "but Rome treats us as slaves. His words ignited the pride of the Goths. For a people long divided by clan rivalries, suffering forged a new bond. Across the Danuban provinces, Gothic camps transformed into armed communities. Weapons were hidden, alliances sealed, and scouts sent to watch Roman movements. The Gothic history of this migration was no longer about crossing borders. It was about survival and justice. The barbarian migration of 376 had entered a new phase, one that would soon ignite into rebellion. Inside the Roman Empire, ordinary citizens grew uneasy. They saw thousands of foreigners flooding their provinces, their strange clothes, their foreign tongue, their sheer numbers unsettling the balance of daily life. To Roman landowners, the Visigoths were both threat and opportunity, cheap labor on one hand, potential raiders on the other. The empire had long absorbed outsiders, granting them citizenship, turning enemies into allies. But never had such a vast and sudden migration occurred. The Visigoths were not a trickle of wanderers. They were a nation on the move. For Rome, accustomed to power, this tested its ability to control, to integrate, and above all, to endure. Rome's acceptance of the Visigoths was a gamble by Emperor Valens. He believed that by granting asylum, he could strengthen his armies. But the empire was already strained. Civil wars had weakened its structure, and resources were thin. Instead of allies, the Visigoths became a burden. Roman administrators, corrupt and overwhelmed, failed to provide the promised support. What should have been an orderly settlement dissolved into chaos. The Visigoths, once seeking peace, now marched in anger. For Gothic history, 376 AD marked the moment they ceased to be refugees and became a force Rome could not ignore. The barbarian migration was no longer a plea for safety, it was a demand for survival. The Danubian provinces became a cauldron of tension. Roman garrisons tried to contain the Visigoths, but their numbers overwhelmed every attempt. Meanwhile, Gothic scouts began raiding farms to feed their starving families. Skirmishes broke out between Roman patrols and Gothic bands. Blood was spilled and trust collapsed. The refugee crisis had transformed into open conflict. For the Roman Empire, what began as an act of mercy now threatened the stability of an entire frontier. For the Visigoths, betrayal justified resistance. Their migration, born in fear of the Huns, had brought them face to face with a new and equally dangerous enemy, Rome itself. The spark of rebellion was lit when a Roman commander attempted to disarm a group of Visigoths. Tensions boiled over, swords were drawn, and blood stained the soil. Word of the skirmish spread like wildfire through the Gothic camps. Families who had endured hunger and humiliation now rose in fury. Fritigern seized the moment, calling his people to arms. He argued that Rome had broken its promise, and the gods themselves demanded justice. What began as isolated clashes soon evolved into organized defiance. The Visigoth migration, once a movement of refugees, had turned into the march of an angry nation ready to fight for its survival. Fritigern's leadership transformed the scattered Gothic clans into a united army. Men who had been weakened by hunger now found strength in rage. They raided Roman supply lines, seizing grain and weapons. Villages burned, roads grew unsafe, and panic spread among Roman settlers. What Rome had once viewed as manageable became a wildfire they could not contain. The Visigoths, once begging for scraps, now marched with defiance. For the Roman Empire, this was more than a rebellion. It was the beginning of a war on its own soil, fought not by invaders from beyond the frontier, but by refugees within its heart. As Gothic raids intensified, Emperor Valens realized the magnitude of his mistake. From his capital in Constantinople, he sent orders to assemble an army. Roman legions were called from distant provinces to suppress the uprising. Yet the empire's forces were stretched thin. Civil strife, Persian threats in the east, and unrest along other borders weakened Rome's response. Meanwhile, every victory fed Gothic confidence. What had begun as survival was now a struggle for dominance. The Visigoths had crossed into Roman territory as desperate refugees, but within months, they had become Rome's greatest internal enemy. The countryside of Thrace became the battlefield of a growing war. Gothic bands struck swiftly, burning estates and defeating small Roman units. They avoided pitched battles, preferring raids that weakened the empire day by day. Roman settlers fled their homes, creating waves of fear that rippled all the way to Constantinople. Fritigern proved to be not only a survivor, but a strategist, shaping his people into a mobile force the Romans struggled to contain. The Visigoth migration, born from desperation, had evolved into a campaign of resistance. Rome now faced not a horde of beggars, but a disciplined enemy born of hardship and injustice. By 377 AD, the Gothic crisis had grown into open rebellion. Roman forces engaged the Visigoths in scattered battles, but victory proved elusive. The Goths fought with desperation, every clash fueled by hunger and vengeance. Roman soldiers, once confident, began to fear the mobility of their enemy. Fritigern's army struck where Rome was weakest, avoiding traps, then vanishing into the countryside. To the Romans, these were no longer mere barbarians. They were a nation fighting for survival. The Visigoth migration, which began as a plea for sanctuary, had turned into one of the deadliest challenges the empire had faced in centuries. Emperor Valens, determined to crush the rebellion, underestimated the strength of his enemy. He believed the Visigoths could be broken quickly, and he sought glory in defeating them without waiting for reinforcements from the Western Empire. But Rome's arrogance blinded it to the reality on the ground. The Visigoths were no longer desperate refugees. They had become hardened fighters, their families pushing them forward, their rage giving them purpose. Valens's decision set the stage for disaster. The Gothic migration, once seen as a humanitarian gesture, was now spiraling toward one of the greatest military confrontations in Roman history. In the summer of 378 AD, the Roman and Gothic destinies collided near the city of Adrianople. The Visigoths, strengthened by alliances with other barbarian groups, gathered under Fritigern's command. Emperor Valens led the legions in person, eager for victory. The battle that followed would become a nightmare for Rome. Under the blazing sun, Roman formations collapsed against Gothic cavalry charges. The legions, once the pride of the empire, were annihilated. Emperor Valens himself perished. His body never recovered. The Visigoth migration had culminated in catastrophe for Rome. The empire had not only failed to control its refugees, it had been shattered by them. Thus ended the first great chapter of the Visigoth migration. What began with families begging for sanctuary on the Danube had ended with the destruction of a Roman army and the death of an emperor. The Roman Empire, once master of the known world, discovered that its strength could no longer guarantee security. For the Visigoths, history remembered them not as helpless refugees, but as a people who reshaped the fate of Europe. The migration of 376 AD revealed a truth that would echo through centuries. Empires may build walls, but when desperation drives nations, no barrier can stand forever.